The 1940s in America was a time of deep-seated racial segregation and systemic racism, particularly in the South, but also in other parts of the country. This era was marked by Jim Crow laws, racial violence, and widespread discrimination in nearly every aspect of life, including education, employment, housing, and the military. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation, especially in southern states. These laws mandated separate facilities for black and white people, including schools, restaurants, buses, and even drinking fountains. Black Americans were systematically denied their rights, treated as second-class citizens, and subjected to both legal and extralegal violence.
Today, just as in these scenes, the armies of the United Nations have made their first landings on the soil of Western Europe. Another of the great decisive battles of world history has been joined. This is the day for which free people long have waited. This is D-Day.
During World War II, black Americans served in the U.S. military but were largely restricted to segregated units. Black soldiers often received inferior training, supplies, and assignments compared to their white counterparts. The Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African-American pilots, were among the few who managed to break through some of these racial barriers and prove their capability in combat. African-Americans serving in the military experienced the paradox of fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. This contradiction fueled the civil rights movement and increased pressure to end segregation in all aspects of American life, including baseball. While the Negro Leagues thrived during the war, the increased scrutiny on racial inequality set the stage for their eventual decline. The success of Negro League players highlighted the talent that Major League Baseball was ignoring. The war also caused many players to be drafted, which caused some changes to the stability of the Negro Leagues. In a sense, World War II created a climate in which racial segregation became increasingly untenable, paving the way for Jackie Robinson's historic debut and the eventual integration of Major League Baseball. At home, black workers faced job discrimination and were often relegated to lower-paying positions. Factories that were producing war materials frequently refused to hire black employees until President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 in 1941, which banned racial discrimination in defense industries. However, despite this order, racism remained a major obstacle in employment. The 1940s were a period of extreme racial injustice, but also a time when black Americans began to push back against systemic racism. Though segregation was still entrenched, the seeds of the modern civil rights movement were being planted, setting the stage for the legal and social battles that would follow in the coming decades.
Yeah, it was really interesting to me as someone who grew up outside the city to learn just how segregated Washington was during the 1940s. You know, you read about the civil rights movement in Birmingham and Montgomery, and Washington didn't have that type of segregation. There weren't signs all over the city that said, you know, white and colored. There weren't necessarily your white and colored drinking fountains, but there were just, because the federal government was there, was probably the reason there weren't signs, but there were places where black people just couldn't go. There were some department stores where blacks could try on clothes, or they couldn't. There were some department stores where blacks couldn't go at all. There were 4 or 5 movie theaters in town that were black-only movie theaters, and they couldn't go to the white-only movie theaters at all. There were a few white-only movie theaters where maybe they could sit up in the balcony. There were only 4 high schools that black people could go to in the 40s and the 50s. So what happened in Washington was black people, and it all centered around this U Street, where U Street is and where Georgia Avenue, which was called 7th Street back then, was. They created their own sort of social world. They called U Street the colored man's Connecticut Avenue. So in doing so, you had, and the basis of it, the real nexus of it was really Howard University, where you had all of these elite blacks, educated blacks, coming into the city to go to Howard, to teach at Howard. You know, it was basically the Harvard of black colleges because blacks were excluded from white colleges, and particularly the black professors, many of whom were the greatest black minds in the country, were excluded from teaching at white universities.
From the early to mid-1900s, U Street flourished as Black Broadway, a thriving center of African American culture. It was a time when racial segregation limited opportunities for Black Americans, but U Street became a place of vibrant community and artistic expression, much like Harlem in New York City. Both were centers of Black-owned businesses, providing essential services and economic opportunities for their communities. They served as important social spaces where people gathered, socialized, and built community. The U Street corridor was renowned for its music scene, particularly jazz. Legendary performers like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, and many others graced the stages of iconic venues like the Howard Theater and the Lincoln Theater. These theaters were not just entertainment venues, they were vital community spaces. Beyond music, U Street was also a center for intellectual and social activity with prominent figures like James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston.
And then right in the middle of all of this black culture and intellectual life, you had Griffith Stadium, which was just down the street from Howard University. And so you had Griffith Stadium basically in the heart of this black middle-class neighborhood in Washington.
You know what really blew me